Hello, it's Jacob, and in this video, we'll be talking about labor unions and Marxism. Now, before we get into the topic proper, I want to talk a little bit about why I am teaching this material where I am, because everything in my course has a purpose. Every topic I cover is carefully thought out in terms of what comes before it and what it flows into. Now, normally during the fall and spring, I teach labor unions and Marxism after competition and before corporations. And I do so as part of a larger unit that I call History, Labor, and Capital. And the name really kind of sums up what it's all about. You've got these two forces in the modern world, these two forces that are in a constant state of tension, that often want to pull against each other, in which are mutually necessary to make society function. You have the energy of workers, you have the people, labor, that actually make the goods, and then you have the machinery and the land and the funds to buy all of this, all that we collectively call capital, that the workers work upon. You have the material from which our whole world, our whole existence is spun, and then you have those who spin it. And each of these is in some sense embodied by a type of institution that is all their own. For labor, it's the labor union. And for capital, it's the corporation. And both of them are incredibly important. Both of them are also incredibly modern. If you go back more than, let's say 3 centuries, just to be on the safe side, if you go back more than 3 centuries, neither of these ideas means much to the average person. And yet it's impossible to imagine living without them today. And despite that, they're still often very misunderstood. And so I teach in longer form on both of these subjects. What is a union and a corporation? Where does it come from? And by focusing on the history of it, we can also get a better appreciation of why it exists. By seeing the way in which it comes into existence, we can see how it solves a certain problem, a problem that may not be obvious to us today, but which never went away. At the same time, I use that unit to explore some of the ugliness of capitalism as well. And this is where it ties back into competition. Labor unions exist to try to form a cartel on the supply of labor to a given industry. They are inherently anti-competitive by nature. But when they first emerged, it was in an environment where capitalism didn't really look like capitalism. Employers back in the day frequently had recourse to violence as a way to try to intimidate their workers, to use them more like slaves than as free people. And so in that unit, we trace a specific story from American history, one which I am more than happy to share materials with you on if you want to explore it on your own. But we explore a specific part of American history that demonstrates how capitalism functions in a healthy society by comparing it to its own worst case scenario. Well, in this summer course, I've cut much of that material for the sake of time, because I understand that if I make the class 3 times as fast, it's not 3 times as hard, it's more like 6 times as hard, keeping up with all of the videos, keeping up with all of the homework. But in a way, it's just as well that we get to cover it here instead. See, I like to use history, labor, and capital as a transition from microeconomics to macroeconomics. We can slowly build out of microeconomics by talking about an industry at a time, but by shifting our perspective towards larger forces, historical change, institutions of society. It helps to get us thinking about society as a whole, which then makes macroeconomics flow much more naturally. Well, in a similar way, we can use Marxism as a bridge to move from talking about business cycles, the short term of macro, to talking about growth economics, the long term of macro. And the reason is because Marx did a lot of work on both. Marx had his own version of the business cycle, and we'll talk about it in brief in this topic. But Marx also had his own views on history as a whole. He had his own views on political systems and economic systems and even culture, and how all of these things influence each other to create this sort of never-ending churn, this constant process of change, evolutionary change. And that drives everything. Now, Unit 4 is not going to be from a Marxist perspective. Marx is, as I've mentioned before, heterodox. But Marx was one of the first economists to really start thinking in this way. In the same way that Keynes may have been wrong, but he was still very important in getting the ball rolling on creating macroeconomics. Marx, in some ways, might have really been one of the first men to really think about growth economics. And so we're going to use this topic as a way to transition. And I'll also teach you a little bit about labor unions.